Akiko Hart comes to us from Mind in Camden in the UK, where she serves as project manager for the Hearing Voices project. As part of her work, she helps set up and facilitate Hearing Voices groups and networks in a variety of settings, including the community, inpatient units, children and adolescent mental health services, prisons, secure units, and immigration removal centers, also known as detention centers. She has a keen interest in how cultural and national context affects the provision of mental health services, as well as how the roles of privilege and power impact and challenge our ability to work together in truly intersectional ways. Please welcome Akiko Hart.
Can you hear me now? Yep, cool. Thank you for inviting me to be with you here today. It's a huge privilege and an honor. The Congress is one of the highlights of my year, and today has additional significance because it is the 17th of August, which is my birthday. So I'm hoping to celebrate. Okay, this is why I love the Congress. Okay. So yeah, I'm hoping to celebrate it with you tonight. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm also going to try and speak really slowly because I'm aware there's interpretation. So if you feel I'm going too fast, just kind of like wave in my direction and I'll try and slow down a bit. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about change. I'm going to talk to you about our work in prisons and forensic secure units. I'm going to talk to you about hope and hopelessness. I'm going to talk to you about how our work has affected change, and I'm also going to reflect on the challenges and limitations inherent in changing and influencing views and models and systems. So I work as the Hearing Voices project manager at Mind in Camden in London, in the UK. And our Hearing Voices work was started by Jackie Dillon in 2005, and it was continued and developed by Rachel Waddingham in 2007. And we now have a team of 7 people working on Hearing Voices, and they're awesome, so I'm going to name them. There's Eve, who's sitting over there, who's going to be doing a couple of workshops this Congress. So there's John, there's Jason, there's Shanika, there's Jessica, and there's Bonnie. So there's 7 of us. And what we do is we help set up and sustain Hearing Voices groups in the community, in inpatient settings, with children and young people in adolescent inpatient units, in prisons and secure units, and now in immigration removal centres. The guiding principles of our work at Mind in Camden are probably 2 things. We go where the need is greatest, and we try and effect real change. Our prisons work has been running since 2010 on a 3-year funding cycle, so we've just started a new one. And we're funded by grant-making trusts. At the moment, we're funded by the Tudor Trust, City Bridges, Paul Hamlin, Sir Halley Stewart, and the Bromley Trust. And the bulk of the funding actually goes towards salaries and the costs associated with training. It's essentially a capacity-building project. So we train staff in prisons and secure units, and we support them to help set up groups. And the thinking behind that is for meaningful change to take place, it actually has to occur from within. So does it work? We've trained over 1,000 staff, officers, nurses, occupational therapists, clinical psychologists, and more. And we've helped over 1,000 men and women in groups. We have at the moment 10 groups in prisons and 12 groups in secure units. And we've just launched the first ever Hearing Voices group in an immigration removal centre. We've also extended our work to working with women in prison, and I'm especially keen to support trans women in prison who hear voices. So does it work? Yeah, I mean, this is what I say to funders. The groups decrease isolation and stigma, they increase coping strategies, they increase hope for the future. And, that's all true, but here's what I'll say to you. The groups work because they exist. They just are. They open up a space where there are no outcomes or outputs, where people can just be with one another. They offer hope, but perhaps even more importantly, they honor hopelessness. So in my experience, one of the pervasive themes of hearing voices groups in forensic settings is actually hopelessness. And I find it really hard to untangle this hopelessness from the lived experience of imprisonment itself, because the men and the women that we support, they're deprived of their freedom and their autonomy in kind of like small and large ways. They don't decide when and what to eat, and they're also living apart from their families and their children and their partners. They feel powerless. I've witnessed the despair of people who've just been sentenced, but also the darkness of people who had a decade left to serve. 10 years. I've met people in secure forensic units who didn't know when they were going to be leaving because that decision was contingent on the decision of the psychiatric team, not on a fixed sentence. I met people who were on their 4th or 5th offence and who said, with the best will in the world, I'm going to get out of here and I'm going to come back in again because that's just what happens to me. I heard people talk about how they were trapped in their cells with their monsters that they could hear and that they could sense and see, and that there was no escape. And with all these stories, I find it really, really hard to find hope in these stories. We've also started to do work in immigration removal centres, which I think are known here as detention centres. We launched the first Hearing Voices group there at Heathrow Immigration Removal Centre, so Heathrow IRC, which is the largest IRC in Europe. It has 1,000 men on 2 different sites. So IRCs are places where people are held for days, sometimes months, sometimes longer, while their status is being processed by immigration authorities. So typically in an IRC, a third of people will end up being released back into the community, a third of people will be transferred to another IRC, and a third of people will be deported back to their country of departure. And there's something about this kind of huge disparity in outcomes which I find, deeply unsettling. Much like prisons, these environments I find, are a mix of kind of sensory overload and deprivation in that, the buildings are really grey and drab, but it's incredibly noisy. That there is so much shouting going on. Yeah, there's nothing to do there except smoke and talk to people and chase your paperwork. It's a very unnerving experience. And here, the men that I met, they felt punished, even though they weren't. Even though they weren't in a custodial environment like a prison, technically, that's how they experienced it. They talked to me about their lives being in the hands of others. And they had this kind of hope mingled with hopelessness, because in a way there was hope that they could be released, but the hope itself was quite arbitrary. So it kind of felt like a really difficult thing to hold. I find it really hard to leave IRCs when I'm in there, but at the same time I can't wait to get out. And there's a kind of a deep irony in the fact that I need my British passport to get in, and this is the British passport that they need to get out. And I find that really, really hard to sit with. I find, in a way, the hopelessness in IRC is actually more challenging than the hopelessness in prisons. In prisons in the UK, unless you're on something called an imprisonment for public protection sentence, which essentially means that you can't really leave, most people... that there was an end in sight. And that's just not the case with ILCs. In prisons, some people can make sense of their sentence in terms of their offence. But in ILCs, most people talk about a deep sense of injustice, of their lives not being in their hands. And for me, again, that was so difficult to sit with, both on an individual level, but also in terms of feeling powerless about the wider political process. So the shades and depths of these different types of hopelessness can kind of feel too much for me, and I really struggle to kind of find the appropriate response, because actually hope feels really inadequate, because who am I to offer hope? What do I know about their lives and their potential futures? And hope in this context can almost feel shallow and easy and inauthentic. But in hearing voices groups in these settings, sometimes something really transformative would happen. So someone would share their hopelessness, and typically there'd be a silence afterwards, and there wouldn't be any kind of sense of consolation, anyone saying things are going to get better. There was a sense that we were bearing witness to this hopelessness, that it was kind of held collectively for a moment within the group. And it really felt to me that perhaps hope is not the adequate response to hopelessness, but perhaps a better response is connection. So, hearing voices groups in forensic settings, they're also really important, I think, because they open up a space for staff to be brave, to be themselves, to be human, which kind of feels like a massive thing. It's also the most challenging thing to kind of work with in training. But here's the thing. Is it really possible for a member of staff to take off their institutional hat for the hour that the group lasts and be human for that hour, and then when the group ends, put that hat back on again? Is the danger here with these groups in institutional settings that we have all the garments of peer support, that we have the language of peer support, but that in fact underneath nothing has changed? Is it actually possible to effect real change in institutional settings? So when our project, our Prisons and Secure Units project, which is called Voices Unlocked, when it started 7 years ago, it was uphill work to convince prisons and secure units that we had something of value to offer them. Since then, it's actually become a lot easier. We barely advertise our training. It just kind of advertises itself through word of mouth. We have prisons kind of phone up and say, hey, can we set up a hearing voices group? Which is kind of weird, but yeah, we get that. And in many ways, it's hugely positive. And perhaps it indicates that out there's an appetite to do things differently, perhaps. But actually, it worries me. It worries me because is it actually because peer support is becoming more embedded, more mainstream? Is it actually because it meets the kind of strategic objectives of the organization to set up a hearing voices group? And these things aren't mutually exclusive, it could be kind of great for us and great for them. But it kind of worries me, and it feels to me that we need to remain vigilant, because actually, our ethos, it's so radical. It shouldn't be an easy thing to do. It should actually be deeply unsettling and destabilizing for them to have a hearing voices group. And it feels really important to me that I hold on to that in some way. So if I'm thinking more broadly about institutions, so there's a part of me, this is me speaking in a personal capacity here, not a Minding Camden one. There's a part of me that looks at our prisons and our detention centres and our psychiatric hospitals, and there's a part of me that wants to burn them down. and I don't, for a number of reasons, mainly self-preservation, but also because of something deeper. You see, I believe that the systems we have built in our image. The power imbalances, the deep inequalities, the iniquities, the abuse that we can witness on wards, the cynicism, the violence, the dehumanization, these do not just exist in our institutions. They are everywhere around us. They are in our schools, in our communities, and in our workplaces. They are on our streets. They are in our parks, and they're sometimes in our homes. They're not just in institutions. And I also believe that it isn't just that the system dehumanizes people. I believe that the systems we have can only exist if they are built on the premise that some of us are human and some of us are not. So for me, the power of hearing voices groups in these institutional settings is that it confronts this head on. It doesn't mend it, doesn't fix it. But as James Baldwin says, and I've been reading a lot of James Baldwin this holiday, it feels particularly relevant at the moment, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And it seems to me that being human in these dehumanizing spaces is what we do. It's all we can do. You know, I don't know how to change the system, but I'm wondering if, as Ken said yesterday, this is perhaps how we move the iceberg. You know, all I know is what the Hearing Voices movement has taught me, what you guys have given me, which is a kind of continual lesson in how to be human. You know, Ubuntu, I am because you are. As James Baldwin says, the fight begins in our hearts. Thank you.